All right, going through some of our review worksheets here, we'll start with Chapter 17, Section 1, and kind of work through them, and then kind of generally talk about some things that you should be kind of aware of. So remember, Chapter 17, we're looking at progressivism as a movement, and Section 1 spends a great deal of time looking at kind of what were the four goals of progressivism, and then what were some reforms that people typically made during the progressive movement. So if we look at the four goals of progressivism, hopefully you're able to pick these out, and they're not not all that difficult of concepts. But when we look at the four goals, the first one is protecting the social welfare. So we mentioned several examples of that in class, but you should have a general idea as we go through these examples or things that fit under that goal. So with protecting the social welfare, we talked about the social gospel movement and settlement houses, which both of those things were aimed at helping kind of the urban poor, those types of things. We mentioned the YMCA, the Salvation Army, and then Florence Kelly becoming an advocate for improving the lives of women and children, and how she became kind of the chief inspector of Illinois factories, and passed the Illinois Factory Act. Those kind of things all fit under that goal of protecting the social welfare. The second goal of the progressive movement was the promoting moral improvement. And under that, we mainly focused on prohibition, and that actually ties in nicely with question number 12 there about what the prohibition movement was. And again, if we look at promoting moral improvement as that second goal, that was about uplifting yourself through better behavior, and people thought that alcohol was causing people to kind of lose their American values, and so it was out, you know, it was banning the sale of alcohol is what prohibition was. And so prohibition fits into the progressive movement because it's about improving your moral compass, so to speak. And so we looked at that. The third goal of progressivism was creating economic reform. And that was about how a lot of people did not feel that the capitalistic system was working for them, and they started to look to other places. The Panic of 1893 was kind of the cause of this, and as people looked to other places, Eugene V. Debs and socialism, a lot of his ideals started to gain a little bit of traction, or people saw kind of the or saw some truth in a lot of Deb's criticisms. So there's that goal. And then finally, we looked at fostering efficiency in a concept known as scientific management. So those are the four goals of progressivism. We already talked about number 12. We look at number 13 there. It says, how did natural disasters help launch the movement to reform local government? And the idea here is that oftentimes natural disasters kind of point out some of the inadequacies or some inefficiencies in government. And oftentimes, if you want to see if something's performing well, you look at how it performs in the time of crisis. And that was the same thing here. We mentioned specifically a hurricane in Galveston, Texas, and a flood in Dayton, Ohio, and how those issues again pointed out some of the problems in government. Number 14 says, how did reform mayors clean up their local governments? Again, that was talking, that ties in a little bit to the ideas we just talked about, but it's also the ideas of just making government work a little bit more efficiently. Again, 13 and 14 are very closely tied together. You could really have the same answers for both those. The one thing you would probably want to add to number 14 is how a lot of those mayors, and we mentioned this in class, tried to look at like utilities that were often privately owned and turn those into publicly owned things to avoid some of the fraud that was there. with those types of things. Um, Number 15 looks at how did reforms protect children and change working conditions. Um, Again, there were a lot of reforms that we talked about in this section, but we mentioned the National Child Labor Committee and some efforts they made as far as showing people kind of some of the bad things that were going on with child labor. They you know, produced material. They went around and showed exhibits of photos of children that were, um, I don't know, harmed or whatever. And it eventually led to the passage of the Keating-Owing Act in 1916, which basically prohibited the transportation of goods made by child labor across state lines. And so, again, it did start to protect children. Even though that law was declared unconstitutional, states are going to begin to pass laws that do ban child labor. And then number 16, if you look at what kind of political reforms took place at the state level, there's lots of things here. The things you should have, though, are initiative, referendum, recall, and then the 17th Amendment. And how, really, again, if you look at the overall idea of progressivism, keeping the government in the hands of the people, those all fit with that. Again, you should know what those things are, but again, initiative is just a bill that originates by the people rather than lawmakers. A referendum is a vote on that initiative, and then a recall is the ability to remove a political official from office by a vote. And then with the 17th Amendment, that requires the direct election of senators rather than through being picked by state legislators, which was the practice prior to the passage of the 17th Amendment. Again, that brings government closer to people because now they're actually voting on that. So those are the things you should have under that question. All right, sorry about that there. I was trying to pull up section 2 and I ended up pulling up a calendar. Sorry about that. So we'll go on to section 2, which is looking at kind of women's role in women in public life during the progressive era. And with women during this time period, they're becoming much more involved, and there's reasons for that. But if we look at before the Civil War, most women worked either in the home or as some sort of domestic worker. But as conditions change, we had new inventions that we talked about where women started to go back to work, or new types of jobs. Women are going to be more and more and more involved in the workforce. Most of these women are going to end up working in manufacturing or the garment trade, where their pay, if we look at number 6, is not on par with that of men, and again, that generally has to do with the fact that, and we talked about this in class, that if you were a woman, you were perceived to be single, only supporting yourself. Well, if you were a man, you were supposedly supporting a family. So that's kind of why that kind of took there. If we look at number 7, it said, why did women take white-collar jobs? Generally, those were the types of jobs that were available to them. Women had started to become much more educated. We had the rise of women colleges, and through that, a lot of the jobs they took ended up being what you would consider white-collar jobs or more professional jobs. They worked in factories, they worked in offices, and those types of things. The invention of the telephone and the typewriter really made an explosion in white-collar jobs, and that's where women ended up working. And again, that kind of ties in with number 8 there. It said, how did the opening of women's college help create new opportunities for women? And again, as they become educated, that's going to open them up to more experiences, more training for those jobs. If you look at number 9 there, it says, why were there are women leaders in the movements to reform social welfare, public morals, and race relations. And again, women often took the lead in these areas because this is the way women could affect change. Again, this is prior to women's suffrage, so they could not vote. And so the way they could really affect change was by leading these movements. And so that's why you saw women involved in that. Susan B. Anthony, she's a leading proponent of women's suffrage. And she's got kind of a famous quote about the right to vote where she says, "I would sooner cut off my right hand than ask the ballot for the black man and not for the woman." So together with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she founded the National Women Suffrage Association, which united with another group to become the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or the NAWSA. And again, she's just a strong proponent in the women's suffrage movement, but her basic contribution was, again, the founding of the NWSA. And then number 11, what was the three-part strategy for women's suffrage? This is pretty important that you know. Again, the first part of the plan was to lobby individual states or territories for the right to vote. They had some success in this with Wyoming, Utah, Idaho, Colorado, all granted women the right to vote, but it really kind of stopped there. The second part of the strategy was to pursue cases that tested the 15th Amendment, or excuse me, the 14th Amendment, which basically said that if you denied any part of your citizenry this right to vote, you would lose that same representation in Congress. Women's argument was they were citizens, so they should be allowed to vote, or their state should lose that representation in Congress. They don't get very far on this part of their plan. Susan B. Anthony, along with other women, are going to test the question by attempting to vote at least 150 times in 10 states and the District of Columbia, but each time the Supreme Court is going to rule that women were indeed citizens, but just because you're a citizen doesn't mean you automatically have the right to vote. So that doesn't really work in their favor. The third goal was the third part of their plan was pushing the national government to adopt a national constitutional amendment that granted women the right to vote. Again, this is kind of a long process. Eventually, women are going to win the right to vote with the 19th Amendment, which is passed by Congress in 1919 and then adopted by the states in 1920. But it's kind of a long, slow process, and it's really not till World War I that really women are granted that right to vote. Moving on to section 3, which is probably my favorite section. It's the Teddy Roosevelt section. I think you guys have gotten a picture that I'm a fan of Teddy Roosevelt. So the first question about Teddy Roosevelt and how he became president. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt, he's an interesting guy. He had a long career before becoming president, a pretty varied career. He was born into privilege, those types of things. But he had risen to the point of being the governor of the state of New York. Well, he wasn't overly popular in New York with some of the political machinery there. A lot of people in his own party did not like him. And so they convinced Teddy Roosevelt, and they got Teddy Roosevelt on the ticket with William McKinley in the 1900 election. Well, McKinley, shortly after taking office, is assassinated. Thus, we have Teddy Roosevelt, excuse me, that is now president. And again, Teddy Roosevelt is a man. There's a lot of stories about Teddy Roosevelt. Probably the thing that brought him the most national prominence, though, was his involvement in Cuba in 1898. So basically, Roosevelt was an advocate for war with Spain, and he had a volunteer cavalry brigade, which was known as the Rough Riders. that played a pretty prominent role in the battle at San Juan Hill in Cuba. And so through kind of these exploits, Roosevelt kind of comes home and he's kind of just this hero. And again, it's just kind of a national story about how Roosevelt went down there and kind of kicked butt and then came back. So that's kind of generally what leads him to the level of national prominence. As far as Roosevelt creating the modern president, he's really the first one that uses the presidency as a bully pulpit, and where he really uses his influence to get things done and to influence votes in Congress and those types of things. And his square deal is simply his term for the progressive programs and the ways in which he's wanting to help the people. Roosevelt basically kind of thought that the federal government was responsible for the national welfare, and so that the federal government should step in when the states kind of failed to deal with the problem. So that kind of all fits in with his square deal ideology. Number 12, how did Roosevelt's intervention in the coal strike set a precedent for federal arbitration? Again, we talked about this in class when we filled out those charts, that although there was no kind of laws passed, Roosevelt didn't really pass any legislation, but it did demonstrate a new principle. And basically, the idea is that from the 1902 coal strike on, when a strike threatened the public welfare, the federal government was expected to intervene. So that's kind of, again, with number 12 there, as far as the intervention in the coal strike setting a precedent for federal arbitration. It's basically that the government's going to intervene when a strike threatens the national welfare. As far as what did Roosevelt do to trust in railroads, Roosevelt is kind of known as a trust buster. He pursues a lot of court cases under the Sherman Antitrust Act. As far as railroads, he does pass some legislation. The Hepburn Act of 1906 was one of them. We also have the Interstate Commerce Act. But again, he reduced and limited the influence and power of the railroads. Number 14 said, what legislation passed in Roosevelt's presidency protected citizens? What did Roosevelt do to protect the environment? Again, if we're looking at Roosevelt, he's a progressive. We've got the Meat Inspection Act, the Food and Drug Act, which obviously protected the citizens from pretty rancid meat, unsanitary conditions. The Pure Food and Drug Act protected them from dangerous food products, drug products, made them have truthful labels, that kind of thing. And then with the environment, Roosevelt is a conservationist. He set millions of acres aside for conservation measures. And so, that's pretty straightforward. Number 15 says, who is Booker T. Washington? Booker T. Washington, again, is he's an African American leader. He is somebody that Roosevelt actually, well, falling short on civil rights, is somebody that Roosevelt kind of supports. Booker T. Washington was the head of the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute, which was an all-black training school. He is the African American leader that's most respected by whites, but W. Du Bois, on the other hand, is a little less, I think, respected by whites, or kind of with some of his beliefs. W. Du Bois did not. He disagreed with Booker T. Washington, because Booker T. Washington basically kind of accommodated segregation and kind of blamed poverty, black poverty, on blacks, and urging them to kind of accept discrimination. That was kind of what Booker T. Washington did. W. Du Bois kind of believes the opposite, and he founds the NAACP. So that's kind of W. Du Bois there. Moving on, we're going to skip section 4 for now, and we'll come back to it. We're going to look at section 5. Section 4, there's that's Taft's administration, and the big thing there that you should know for a future test would be the idea that Taft had a hard time keeping his Republican Party together because of his kind of inability to unite the progressive and conservative wings of his own party in terms of tariffs and conservation and those types of things. If we look at Wilson and how he won the election of 1912, Wilson his progressive reforms are known as the New Freedom. Wilson does a lot of things. But when you look at what he did to use what he used to attack trusts and monopolies, we've got two kind of key pieces of legislation. First, we've got the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914, which sought to strengthen the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. The Clayton Act prohibited corporations from acquiring the stock of another if doing so would create a monopoly. So again, it's more specific than the Sherman Antitrust Act, made that law a little bit stronger, put a little bit more teeth into it. The second major antitrust measure that Wilson kind of enacted is the Federal Trade Commission, which was set up by the Federal Trade Commission Act of 1940. Or 1914, excuse me. This created a watchdog agency, the Federal Trade Commission, which was given the power to investigate possible violations of regulatory statutes and to require periodic reports from corporations and to put an end to a number of unfair business practices. So, under these pieces of legislation, Wilson's going to go after about 400 companies that were engaged in some sort of legal activity. Number 6 says, how were the lowering of the tariff and the introduction of the income tax related? Again, here, and we mentioned this in class, Wilson wanted to lower tariffs. Well, tariffs are the main source of revenue for the government, so the government needed to find a new source of revenue. That new source of revenue was an income tax. So that's that's how those two are related. The income tax then becomes the new source of revenue for the government. Next, Wilson's going to turn his attention to the banking industry and the banking sector. Basically, the nation needed a way to strengthen the way in which banks were run, and they also needed a way to adjust and control the amount of money that was in circulation, or control kind of the money supply. So Wilson's solution is the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which created the Federal Reserve System, where we have these district banks, and then where we have districts that are each headed by a central bank for that district that could then kind of control the banking and the money supply for that sector. If we look at number 8, it says, how did women finally win the right to vote? Again, that has to deal with really women's participation in World War I and the war effort. That's really kind of what that comes down to. There's some other people that we mentioned out of that, especially with Carrie Chapman Catt, who served and created the New York Women's Suffrage Party, where she concentrated on some tactics to really go after it. But again, it's this long, slow process, but eventually it's World War I that's going to push people over the edge. Number 9, we're asking about Wilson on civil rights, and this is a larger theme. Wilson was not a supporter of civil rights. Roosevelt and Taft before him also failed greatly on the civil rights front. Wilson, like I said, is he's from a Southern upbringing, and so that right there is probably going to I don't know, shade his views there. Um, so he he even during his election promises to treat blacks equally, but then again, like I said, he does things like he speaks out against anti-lynching legislation. He appoints fellow white Southerners to his cabinets. Um, so there's really, again, he we mentioned it in class more than once. He's kind of a racist. And then finally, if we're looking at number 10, how did America's entry into World War I affect the reform movement? It basically focused their attention elsewhere and meant that they're going to be less focused on reforms and more focused on the war, and it kind of brings an end to the war effort. So if we're looking at those things, that's kind of the end of